Welcome to Policy Chats, the official podcast of the UC Riverside School of Public Policy. I'm your host, Dori Pham. Join me and my fellow public policy classmates as we explore potential policy solutions for today's most pressing societal challenges. Thank you so much for joining us today, Congressman Obernolte. We are excited to have you on the Policy Chats podcast. Your career brings together technology, entrepreneurship, and public service in a unique way. You have served as mayor of Big Bear Lake and as a member of the California State Assembly, all while building and leading Foresight Studios and earning graduate degrees in artificial intelligence and public administration. In Congress, you have become a leading voice on technology policy, budget reform, and rural issues. As chairman of the Subcommittee on Research and Technology, you have helped shape how Congress approaches emerging technologies like artificial intelligence, working to balance innovation with public accountability. As our school celebrates its 10-year anniversary, with the theme of creating a thriving, prosperous, and abundant world, we look forward to learning from you and from your perspective on how technology policy can support this vision. So to start us off with, can you tell us a little bit about your job and what you do on a day-to-day basis?
Well, certainly. And thank you. It's an honor to be on the podcast. I am Congressman Jay Obernolte. I represent California's 23rd Congressional District. And if your listeners aren't familiar with where that district lies, it is most of San Bernardino County and a little piece of Los Angeles and a little piece of Kern. So I represent a huge chunk of the Inland Empire. If you're driving from Las Vegas to Los Angeles, you're in my district for almost 4 hours. I represent all the Mojave Desert and all the mountains around it. As you mentioned, I have a long history in technology policy. So last year, I chaired the House Task Force on Artificial Intelligence. I currently serve as the chair of the Subcommittee on Research and Technology and the Science, Space, and Technology Committee. And I also serve on the Energy, Commerce, and Commerce Committee. So pretty much all of the committees of jurisdiction for AI. As you mentioned, I have a long history with AI. It seems oddly ironic to me that I find myself helping to lead the policy discussion around artificial intelligence, because it's a little known fact that when I set out in life, I wanted to be a researcher in AI. So my father brought me home an Apple II computer from work, kind of dates me. And he gave me a book on how to teach yourself how to program. And that ignited in me a lifelong learning for both computer science and software engineering. And I looked at the burgeoning field of AI, which was just in its infancy at the time, and said, this is going to change the world. Of course, I thought it was going to be in a year or two, not in 30 years, but nonetheless, it was very exciting. And so I said, I want to be a researcher in AI. And the only way to do that at the time, because there wasn't an obvious profit potential for AI. So if you wanted to study AI, you had to do it in an academic setting. So I went to Caltech in Pasadena, got a degree in computer engineering, and then went to UCLA and was working on my doctorate in AI, doing some of the early research in natural language processing and machine vision, when my side hustle at the time, which I only did to put myself through grad school, I was developing video game software. It turns out that the original Nintendo Entertainment System has the same microprocessor as an Apple II. A lot of people don't know that. I don't know a 6502. And so I was an expert at that processor. And so I was hired when I was at Caltech to help write video game software. And so that's something I continued to do. And then when I was in graduate school working on my doctorate, one of the games that I had written for the Sega Genesis, an NFL football game for Sega Sports, went platinum, as we say in the industry, meaning it was a big hit. And that deflected me out of a career in academia into a career in business. And so I ran a video game development studio for 30 years and eventually did finish my doctorate, but this time in public administration rather than computer science. So it's an honor to be able to help lead the policy discussion at the federal level on not just technology, but AI in particular. A lot of people don't realize that as members of Congress, we legislate on such a wide variety of topics that from a distance, it looks like our knowledge is a mile wide. But if you get close, in most cases, it's only an inch deep because there's just so much to know about. And so we rely on silos where we have subject matter experts that have invested the time and energy to become experts at a certain policy field, and we rely on those silos when we are legislating. So I'm honored that many of my colleagues depend on me to lead the discussion on AI policy, and I'm hopeful that within the next few months, we're going to be implementing a comprehensive federal framework for AI policy. I think I mentioned to you that I was honored to chair the House Task Force on Artificial Intelligence last year. Our stated goal was to, by the end of the year, create a report that proposed a federal regulatory framework for AI. And so we delivered that about almost a year ago now. It was a 270-page report with over 80 concrete policy recommendations for AI. And so now the work shifts from the planning phase, which was the creation of the report, to the implementation phase, which is the crafting and passage of legislation that codifies the report. And that's what we're working on right now.
So for the people who are probably not, most people are not as steeped as you are in AI. And I will just say personally, I appreciate your depth of knowledge in the subject matter in which you're legislating. I've long said people, 99% of what we do, and for those of you who don't remember, I am a former legislator in the California state legislature. 99% of what we do is not gay marriage and abortion. 99% of the airtime is gay marriage and abortion. And so, you're right. A lot of what we do is these sorts of things. And so having experts like you leading the efforts in a very thoughtful, deliberative approach is really appreciated. Let's start at a high level with a question here. A lot of attention has been paid towards generative AI. That's what's grabbing the headlines. It's sexy, but AI is so much more nuanced than that. Can you describe to the listeners a little bit more some of the nuances in AI? When you're thinking about a national AI strategy, what are you thinking about? Is it governed just by an approach to generative? And how do you see other types of AI playing in the government field and in the regulatory framework?
Sure. Well, it's an interesting question because there actually is no concrete legal definition to what AI actually is right now. We've had a lot of different people try to define it. Some people focus, as you say, on generative AI versus non-generative. Some people focus on machine learning and neural nets versus non-machine learning. I try and simplify it for people and say that because AI is so vast, diverse, and nuanced, that when we say AI, I use kind of a layman's definition, and I say that anytime we're talking about something that makes a machine behave like a human or solve problems that up until now we have thought only humans could solve, that is what we mean by artificial intelligence. And it's interesting, when I was back in the day when I was doing research on AI, a lot of the AI that we were using was deterministic versus non-deterministic AI. I mean, when we are using trying to.
Can we call timeout and let you explain deterministic versus non-deterministic in one or two sentences for people?
Sure. So if you're trying to program a computer to navigate a maze, you find out quickly that you get this combinatorial explosion of decisions where it's impossible to sift through the whole maze and try and figure out the best path from point A to point B. And that's equally true of like navigating on streets from one location to another. And so you rely on what computer scientists call heuristics, which are kind of like rules of thumb. Like if you have a choice to turn left or right, always take the choice that is closest to pointing you at your destination, right? And then you backtrack through that, and that really cuts down on the number of branches that you have to take. So that is a deterministic way of solving the problem. You could program a computer to be able to do that. That's very different from training a neural network that is kind of trying to emulate the way the human brain works. And you're training it with lots of examples of what you want it to do, and then and then you feed it novel examples and allow it to do it. That's what we would call a non-deterministic algorithm. So all of that, it sounds super complicated, but it just illustrates how diverse the field of AI is. And so I like to simplify it for people and say, no, when we're talking about AI, we're talking about all of it. We're talking about anything that makes a computer seem like a human.
So deterministic is take me to that Starbucks over there. Non-deterministic is find me the nearest coffee place that meets the best criteria and find the best route to go there.
Well, I mean, I would define it a little differently. I would say deterministic is if I can create a set of rules for you to follow. Okay, well, if you're going to go find your way to the nearest Starbucks, do these things in this order. Non-deterministic is I'm just going to train an algorithm and then I'm going to feed I'm going to train it billions of times with lots of people who have taken different routes to Starbucks, and then I'm going to say, I'm here, tell me how to get to Starbucks, and then it's going to spit out an answer. But I don't know
That's essentially what I was trying to say.
To get that
Although
answer.
I was saying not that specific Starbucks, find me any coffee. I don't want to go to Starbucks. I want to go to a coffee shop somewhere near me. Find me, that sort of thing. So sorry I interrupted, but I felt like it was important to help the listeners understand deterministic versus non-deterministic. Can you give us some good examples, maybe even in the government space if you have them, and if not, just examples of non-generative AI that's widely understood and widely used?
Oh, well, certainly. So most people are shocked to learn that the FDA, the Food and Drug Administration, who is the sectoral regulator that oversees the healthcare in the United States, the FDA has already processed over 1,000 applications for the use of AI in medical devices. So, like a diagnostic test or something that's going to be implanted in your body, and a pacemaker software, things like that. Very important, obviously, to get this regulation correct because it's so consequential.
Mm-hmm.
And yet the vast majority of that is non-generative. So, for example, radiology, let's use this. So if you are looking at a CT scan and you want an algorithm that automates the detection of small tumors in someone's body. So rather than having a radiologist pore over the CT scan, what you want to do with a microscope, what you want to do is have this algorithm automatically flag any of these scans that are problematic, that might contain tumors, and then refer those to a human radiologist who can confirm their presence. So, that's something that's vastly beneficial. That is absolutely non-generative, right? It's not generating text. It's not generating an image. It is a classification problem. Here is a CT scan. Does it contain small tumors? Yes or no? And if so, where are they? Right. So that's a good example of a difference.
That's a great example of difference. Yeah, there are, almost infinite numbers of those types of different things. Everything from detecting. My favorite example of an early one is the spam filter in email. Mm-hmm. It was just simply trained on what spam is, and now it does actually quite a good job of segregating spam versus non-spam. Dori, did you have? I know you had a question you wanted to ask.
Yes, thank you, Lloyd. So my question for you, Congressman Obernolte, is as chair of the House Subcommittee on Research and Technology, you have been closely involved in congressional discussions around artificial intelligence. Many experts argue that AI regulation should be sector specific, with different approaches for healthcare, finance, and national security, while still keeping national standards. Can you share from your perspectives on how Congress should strike this balance and why an agile or incremental approach might be preferable to sweeping one-size-fits-all regulation?
Sure. No, it's a good question. And this was one of the central issues that we considered in our task force last year. The European Union took a very early stance in the regulation of AI. And what they did is they adopted a centralized approach. So they've created a brand new licensing requirement that is a parallel licensing requirement to any sectoral regulation. So, for example, if you let's use the case of the the diagnostic radiology test that we were just talking about. If you wanted to create that, you would have to not only be licensed by the FDA, but also be licensed by another new sectoral regulator that just regulates AI. And they're spinning up a brand new bureaucracy with its own standard of conduct and standard of practice to be able to implement those new regulations. We recommended a different approach, the one that you highlighted, a more sectoral approach to regulation. And we kind of had the benefit of a little bit more time for research on this topic to emerge. So a year and a half ago, NIST, which is the National Institute of Science Standards and Technology, it's pretty much the predominant standard setting organization in federal government. They came out with a study on the risks of AI deployment. And that study has been since recognized as pretty much the furthest thinking document on AI risk that's been written by any governmental entity so far. And what they found out was that the risks of AI deployment are highly contextual, which means it matters very much what you're going to do with the AI when you consider what the risks of deploying it are. Something that is completely benign in one deployment context might be unacceptably risky in another. And so you have to, we don't regulate for the purpose of regulating. We regulate to mitigate harms. And to know what those harms are, you have to consider the context in which an AI algorithm is used. So that's why sectoral regulation makes much more sense. If you're talking about something that with intent that could have incredibly harmful consequences, like getting a test wrong, right? If something misses, if an algorithm misses a tumor, there's a tumor in your CT scan, the algorithm didn't catch it. Well, that's really consequential. Whereas in another usage context, making a mistake like that, like a chatbot picking the wrong word, might be much less harmful. And so that's the reason why you want a sectoral approach to regulation. And then there's another reason, which is that some of these sectors have very complex regulation already, and healthcare is a good example. So the FDA has spent decades in becoming an expert in ensuring patient safety, because that's their gold standard, right? Everything that they do is done from the perspective of patient safety. So the question we have to ask ourselves is it easier to teach a brand new entity that regulates AI everything that the FDA has learned over decades of ensuring patient safety? Or is it easier to teach the FDA what it might not already know about AI? And the answer is clearly the latter and not the former. And that's why we think a sectoral approach makes much more sense.
As a follow-up, how can Congress build a sector-specific approach to AI oversight that stays flexible as models evolve, while still giving regulators and companies a clear and consistent expectations around safety and accountability?
Well, that was the other central thing that we considered in the task force last year. And if anyone is interested, you can download our report. It's got a good executive summary that no, we did not use AI to write, but it's organized in different chapters that anything that you're interested about the work we did is organized in there for you. And again, the report details what our proposed framework looks like. Basically, what we are proposing to implement is something we call the hub and spoke approach. So the spokes are our sectoral regulators, like the FDA, and we already have many federal regulators who are already doing the work of regulating AI within their sectors. Most Americans kind of erroneously think that AI is largely unregulated in the United States. That is absolutely not true. We already talked about the FDA already issuing over 1,000 permits for the use of AI in medical devices, but that's true of lots of other federal agencies. The FAA is already regulating the use of AI in aircraft avionics. NHTSA is already regulating the use of AI in autonomously driven vehicles, and the list goes on and on and on. So those are the spokes in our hub and spoke approach. And then what we're arguing is we need a hub, some kind of repository for technical knowledge, for tools, for resources, and for standard setting. We need an entity that's going to create testing and evaluation methodologies that sectoral regulators can use kind of as a toolbox so they don't have to reinvent the wheel every time they go about evaluating an algorithm. And so we proposed the creation of that. Both two successive administrations have agreed with us. They called it different things. The Biden administration and his AI executive order called it the AI Safety Institute. The Trump administration in the AI action plan that he issued a few months ago, call it CASE, the Center for AI. I forget what it stands for, Strategic Initiative and Advancement, something like that. But essentially, they're proposing to house them in the same place, which is underneath NIST, which is what we recommend as well. That's important because NIST is fundamentally a non-regulatory agency, and therefore is not empowered to require the adoption of the standards that it creates. And that's an important distinction. And so now we need to codify it. We need to back up both of the administrations and actually write this into law, which is what we're proposing to do.
It's an interesting description you gave because, first of all, it highlights that despite, kind of the charged political climate, there is some bipartisan approach to some of the policymaking that isn't necessarily up there. I also really appreciated the kind of the contrast between the European model and the way we're approaching it. I want to ask a follow-up question in two parts, again, relating to kind of bifurcated systems. We touched earlier on generative versus non-generative AI. Are you taking the same regulatory approach with generative versus non-generative AI? If not, how do you think about those differently? It's generally non-generative. I mean, generative AI is the one that is kind of the wild, wild west, unregulated, as you kind of identified. So how do you go about that approach? And I'll get to the second one afterwards.
Sure. No, it's a good question. And it's another thing that we considered in the task force, because what they're doing in Europe is focusing on the regulation of tools. So that's what this new bureaucracy does, is to take a look at specific models and try and come up with a regulatory system that creates requirements and standards for them. But what we think makes much more sense for the U.S. system is to regulate outcomes, not tools. And it really simplifies your job of regulation if you are focusing on the harms that can occur, and then you come up with things that you can do from a regulatory standpoint to mitigate them. So I'll give you a specific example. And then this is another misconception that Americans have about AI being unregulated. They think that we are way behind because we don't have a whole separate body of law that applies to AI. But the reason for that is because we focus on regulating outcomes. So, for example, we don't need a new law that says it is illegal to use AI to steal people's money, even though that kind of cyber fraud and cyber theft is one of the most concerning malicious uses of AI and is something that is exploding right now. It's already illegal. So we don't need a new law that makes it illegal. What we need to do is we need to equip our law enforcement agencies with the tools and the knowledge and the resources that they need to go police it and catch the people that are doing it to prevent it from happening. I'll give you a less obvious example. There was a well-publicized case a few years ago in the early days of AI deployment where a company had come up with an algorithm for the automated screening of resumes. Did you hear about this? So the idea was they wanted to, if someone had a job opening and they got 1,000 applications, they wanted an algorithm to automatically identify the 100 most qualified people for that job that then would be followed up by a human to phone them and identify the 10 people who are going to be brought in for an in-person interview. And that would be obviously hugely useful to companies. So they put this together. It was the early days of AI. Now, with the benefit of hindsight, we would recognize that as a highly consequential decision-making process. So it matters very much to the people that might be falsely winnowed out by that. It would have a huge impact on their life. So we know now to pay special attention to those kinds of deployments. But, it was early days. And so the company made this algorithm, started testing it, and it was determined that the algorithm exhibited some very troubling racial biases. And those biases were not intentional, but they were baked in unintentionally because they were present in the data that was used to train the algorithm. So we learned a lot from that. We learned about the way that biases can influence the training of AI algorithms. We learned about consequential decisions and the need for extra scrutiny. But none of that should distract from the fact that we didn't need another law to make it illegal to use AI in a discriminatory way in hiring practice, because it's already illegal. And even if that algorithm had been deployed, which it was not, but even if it had been, the moment those biases were discovered, it would have become illegal for people to use it. So that's why it makes a lot more sense to focus on regulating outcomes and not regulating tools, because it clarifies the harmful uses that you're trying to mitigate.
So let me clarify this. So then your contention is that there's less of an actual need to regulate generative AI as an entity of itself because Congress is focused on regulating the outcomes of usages of AI rather than the tool itself. Is that a fair assessment?
Yes, and let me give you a specific example that you just
Sure. Yeah.
we've been talking about chatbots, right? Uh,
Yep.
and as it turns out, chatbots can have some really detrimental effects, particularly on young people.
Yeah.
With harms such as like the amplification of suicidal ideology, right? Because AI is designed to be self-gratifying, right? So if you have something that's harmful, it's going to kind of egg you on. The current generation of chatbots, and we really need guardrails that say, look, if you detect this kind of suicidal ideology, particularly in young people, you need to refer it to a human expert, right? And you certainly don't amplify it. You don't continue the discussion, right? So we don't need a specific law that says if you're a chatbot, you do that. We can have a more general discussion about interaction with young people, and the need to not amplify suicidal ideation without having to talk about algorithms and technology. So and it's a much easier discussion to have because you don't have to get into the weeds about exactly what requirements you're going to put on algorithms and how you're going to test them. If you start with what you're trying to accomplish and then work backwards from there, the regulatory landscape is a lot clearer.
Yeah, I appreciate that approach as well. Otherwise, you just get into this vicious cycle of whack-a-mole, and it's a lot harder to kind of take a holistic approach when you take a whack-a-mole approach. That whack-a-mole, since you have a PhD in public policy, I assume that's a very technical public policy term. The second question I wanted to ask on that bifurcated system is, the federal government is taking an approach of really being the leader and prohibiting states from enacting disparate regulations. The states obviously are pushing back on that. I have an opinion on that. I'd love to hear your opinion on that before I espouse my opinion on that. How do you, as the focal point, how do you view the kind of the state's position versus the federal position, and which one you think is better? I think I know where you're going to go with this.
This is a critically important topic, and it's one that we need to solve sooner rather than later because we can. I'll tell you exactly what I think here in a second, but regardless of what we might agree and disagree on, no one can disagree that the current state is highly harmful. We have over 1,000 bills pending in state legislatures across the country just this year on AI. In fact, we'll probably pass 2,000 in a couple of weeks when the calendar rolls over. It'll probably be over 2,000. And some of them have already been signed into law in ways that are extremely far-reaching, including in our home state of California. And we can argue about whether or not those laws are good or bad, but no one can argue that they clearly, in some cases, impinge on the constitutional requirement that Congress be the regulator of interstate commerce, right? And we can argue about what interstate commerce means, but the Article 1 of the Constitution says because we don't want states advantaging themselves, in our system of federalism, when you talk to commerce between the states, it's only Congress that can regulate that. And some of these laws clearly impinge on that because if you're developing an algorithm and you tend to deploy it across different states, the regulation of that development is something that's definitely interstate commerce related. So the risk that we run here is to have the risk of having 50 different state standards for AI, 50 different states going wildly different directions on regulating AI. And when you allow that to happen, which we have in digital data privacy, for example, you wind up with this patchwork of 50 different regulations that is very difficult for small companies to comply with. If you are a big company, like, not to pick on them, but OpenAI or Meta, you have buildings full of lawyers, you have the sophistication to deal with a regulatory system that complicated. If you are two people in a garage trying to start the next Meta or the next OpenAI, you don't. And so big companies use this as a barrier to entry. And that's very destructive to entrepreneurialism. So we don't want that to occur. Now, you put it as kind of a binary choice. Should AI be regulated by the states, or should it be completely regulated by the federal government? And the answer, in my opinion, is neither. I think under our system of federalism, there are large areas of policy that have been delegated to the states. I mean, I'll give you some examples: law enforcement, by and large, education, insurance. Right? You could probably make 24 examples where the federal government has deferred that regulation to the states. And so what we need is a system that creates lanes for both the federal government and the state government. So no one is saying that the state shouldn't have a role to play in regulating AI. But what we are saying is that Congress needs to go first. It needs to define where those guardrails are, what within those guardrails is preempted for regulation only at the federal layer because it is interstate commerce related, and then outside those guardrails where the states can go be the laboratories of democracy that they always have been. But the problem is, if we let the states get too far ahead of us, it's very difficult to put that genie back in the bottle because the states feel a creative ownership of the regulatory structure that they put in place. And we've seen this in other domains like privacy, and we can't allow that to happen with AI, which is why there's urgency.
It's interesting you say that. So I'm gonna quote George Carlin here. George Carlin, I assume you remember the famous comedian George Carlin said,
I wonder if you're going to layer in his F-bombs.
No, I'm not going to layer in the F-bombs. There's no seven words you can't say on television. But he said something along the lines of, having a no smoking section in a restaurant is like having a no peeing section in a pool. I travel all over the country. And once you get to 35,000 feet, you can't see where one state ends and the next starts. You can see differences between geographic features. You can see suburban and rural and all of that. And so I look at this and say, when you're talking about technologies like AI, like internet-based technologies, these transcend borders. They don't know, where one jurisdiction ends and another starts. And so having, a patchwork regulatory framework, I think is really challenging as you approach some of these technologies. But you yourself said you see a place where there perhaps is some state regulation. I would struggle from that perspective because AI is a global, global technology. You've got multiple countries, some on the up and up, others, less, more nefarious. Where do you see roles for state regulation, state policy? I won't even call it regulation. Where would you find appropriate levels of state policy, state law in the AI space?
Sure. Well, let's talk about some specific examples, right? So.
Sure.
One of the things that is regulated largely at the state level is the insurance industry. And so, for example, in the state of California, we have an insurance regulator, we have an elected insurance commissioner, and that the agency he heads, it's Ricardo Lara, who I who I served with in the legislature when I was there. The agency he heads is empowered to approve or disapprove the proposed rates that insurers charge consumers in California. So if you can't just waltz into California and offer insurance and decide on your own rate, you have to apply with this entity to approve it. So you can imagine that if someone were to propose to use artificial intelligence to set the rates that it charges for consumers, the California Department of Insurance would have something to say about the way that those algorithms operated, right? And appropriately so, because they are the ones that are empowered to regulate those rates. There are other states that don't even have a regulator and don't require approval of rate setting, which might have a completely different approach. So, that is something I would say would be completely with in the purview of the states. Talk about law enforcement. And I'm not arguing that this is a good thing or a bad thing. It's mostly a bad thing, from my perspective. But we put a lot of constraints on what law enforcement can and can't do. Those constraints are largely imposed when we're talking about non-federal agencies, which the majority of our law enforcement entities aren't. The California Highway Patrol, our county sheriffs, our municipal police departments, all of those are regulated at non-federal levels. So if you're going to talk about what algorithms can those entities use to, for example, profile criminals, What is probable cause? Are we getting into a minority report situation where an algorithm can look at a bunch of unrelated facts and say, you know what, I think this guy's committed a crime, and or to what degree are law enforcement entities allowed to check up on that? Well, reasonable minds can disagree. We can have a discussion about that, but right now, all of that regulation is done at the state level, not at the federal level. So, I mean, it just makes sense that if you're going to talk about the use of AI by those entities, it should be done in the same conversation as these other things. So, I mean, those are just a couple of examples.
Okay, so you're arguing that you're not arguing about regulating the AI, is the way I heard that. You're arguing about regulating. The states would have a right to argue or to regulate how entities within their states utilize AI, but not the essence of the AI itself.
Okay, we're differentiating between development and deployment. And so the states would regulate, those specific deployments because they're related to what the sectors that the states already regulate within.
And I would agree with you on that. I would not have, in my mind, I was making a different distinction. To me, that's not regulating AI. Regulating AI, it would be something like telling, 50 states telling OpenAI something about the data sets they use to train. You can't have 50 states with a regulatory framework affecting the data sets and the algorithms, but the usage, absolutely. And so I guess that was just a difference in the way we each approach the idea of the question.
Yeah, I mean, you're right, but I'd say it's all AI because the differentiation is development versus deployment. But also, understand if you're talking about the way that an algorithm was developed, that can factor into the deployment. So, for example, you're the California Department of Insurance. You are regulating the use of AI to set rates for consumers within the state of California. You might have a requirement on the data set that was used to train the algorithm that is then deployed. So it all gets, mushed up into this kind of unrecognizable mess. But I think if we focus on outcomes, we don't focus on tools, then we're in a much better place.
Okay. So let's kind of take what I said and go to the next level. Where do you see, and I touched on it in my last question, you've got China, obviously one of the world's leaders in AI. Russia is less public about it, but I assume that Russia is heavily involved in developing different levels of AI. I'm sure there's bad actor states out there as well. Where do you see, U.S. policy regarding AI developed and housed, offshore by other countries? It's not just about a technological lead. It's also about protecting citizens. Kind of talk about AI from a U.S. leadership policy in a world ecosystem.
Right. No, it's a very important question. The U.S. is still the worldwide leader in the development and deployment of AI, but not by much. And China is very close behind. China, back in 2020, embarked on a nationwide campaign to become the worldwide leader in AI by 2030. And they are devoting vast amounts of resource to it. And we have to take that very seriously. If you want to be alarmed by something, think about the fact that 2 years ago, China passed the United States in the number of PhDs it was awarding in the computer sciences. And it is likely this year that they will award double the number of PhDs in computer science that we do. Last year, we awarded about 850,000 four-year bachelor's degrees in the STEM fields in the United States. China awarded last year over 3.2 million, so nearly 4 times as many. So those are very alarming statistics. Now, China has some structural advantages. They have a centralized economy, and so it's very easy for them to say, we're going to have X number of data centers, we're going to build this amount of new energy generation to support them. That's easier for them to implement than it is for us. On the other hand, they have imposed one of the most restrictive schemes on the commercial deployment of AI than anywhere else in the world. So they're creating this vast surveillance state, which gives them access to a lot of data, but they're restricting companies' ability to use that data in ways that empower their economy. And so that gives us an advantage. So we just have to be very cautious about that. And, it's almost like, back to the days of the Cold War. People say, if AI has so much destructive potential, why are we even allowing it? Why don't we just ban it? And what people don't realize is that in this geopolitical competition, it's like the development of a nuclear weapon. China's not going to ban it. Russia's not going to ban it. Iran is not going to ban it. This is happening. And, for better or for worse, from a cybersecurity standpoint, the best defense against the offensive use of AI is the defensive use of AI. AI is really good at cyber defense. It's really good at countering cyber attacks. As we were talking about spam filters on email, right? In terms of detecting the malicious use of AI to steal people's money, AI itself is the best tool for doing that. And so, lots of the solutions to the problems that AI creates are indeed the use of AI. So we can't avoid that. And that's why it's so important for us to get the balance right when we enact a regulatory framework for it.
I agree completely. There is always that knee-jerk reaction of, "Oh, we just ban it." But we've never been very effective at banning anything, honestly. It's
Yeah.
And so you have to go beyond the knee-jerk reaction of like, okay, maybe we don't like certain aspects of it. There's always things we don't like certain aspects of, everything from prohibition on alcohol to social media. But a ban isn't really a practically enforceable thing. And I agree with your assessment. We are in a global ecosystem when it comes to these things. And so if we decide we don't want to do it, we're essentially ceding technology leadership to other states who may, harbor some notion of doing us harm, our citizens harm as well. Dori, I kind of feel like I've monopolized the last few questions. Before we, get to the end, and I know we've got a few more minutes left here. From your perspective as a younger person, you've AI came to the Congress member and I later in our lives. We were adults. We remember times before AI. How do you see AI? And as a younger public policy student, what would you want to ask the Congress member about AI in the future and its impact on your generation?
Thank you so much for the question, Lloyd. So I grew up in a generation where technology was already a part of my everyday life. From the time I was little, the first iPhone and iPad were already around. So engaging with technology has always felt natural to me. As I got older, I started using generative AI tools in simple and practical ways, like helping me fix my grammar or manage small tasks. And it has become something that I integrate into my day-to-day workflow. As a public policy student with a strong interest in foreign policy and diplomacy, one question I think about a lot is how can we manage AI in a balanced way? There is a lot of discussion in schools about how to regulate AI use in assignments, and more broadly, is there like a debate about how to shape AI policy without shutting down innovation? So my question for you, Congressman Obernolte, is this. How can we set guardrails that address concerns about misuse while still allowing companies like ChatGPT, Grok, or Gemini to grow and innovate? How do we create standards that protect students and the public without slowing down the development of tools and that could expand the opportunity and economic growth for my generation?
Sure. No, and this is the central question that the average American asks themselves, right? Because if you stop someone off the street and you ask them, with artificial intelligence, what's the worst thing that can happen? You will get an answer out of a Terminator movie, right? Where an army of evil robots rises up to take over the world. And we know that that's actually not a terribly realistic view of the downsides to AI. But AI does have a lot of downsides. I mean, most prominently in its malicious use, but also, things like energy consumption, job displacement, the spread of mis and disinformation. These are all things we worry about. But that's why it's so important to get the balance right. On the one hand, we have an obligation as governments to mitigate to the extent we can, the harmful consequences of the malicious use of AI for the people that we represent. But we also have an obligation to enable all of the beneficial impacts that this is going to have on our society. And honestly, I think we've done a terrible job at articulating the optimistic case for AI. I mean, and here it is in a nutshell. I mean, first of all, AI is already the most powerful tool for the dissemination of human knowledge that mankind has ever invented. It can teach anyone anything that they want to learn about in whatever learning style is optimal for them. And that's going to accelerate in the short term, in the years to come. And that has profound consequences for human empowerment. But also, AI is likely to be the most powerful tool for the enhancement of human productivity that mankind has ever invented. And that has the potential to not only enhance profits of companies, but to create a rising wave of prosperity that literally lifts all the boats in America. I mean, that's incredible when you talk about that, the amount of prosperity that AI can create. And we don't talk enough about those optimistic cases. And you know what? And one thing I want to say, just to tie back into a discussion we were having, Lloyd, a couple of minutes ago. I think this is a bipartisan sentiment. A lot of I don't think a lot of focus has been focused on the partisan rancor in Congress at the federal level. The parties are at each other's throats to a degree that has not occurred in my political lifetime. I think it's really unfortunate. And we've got all these political red herrings. It seems like every time you turn on the news, you're looking at messaging put out by one party against the other, and both parties are saying the same thing, which is essentially, if we were only in authority, then this bad stuff wouldn't be happening, right? But I think that regulation of AI is a bipartisan topic. Our AI task force report last year was unanimously approved by all 24 members of my task force, 12 Republicans, 12 Democrats, as well as the speaker and his staff and the minority leader and his staff. And like I said, it was 270 pages of, over 80 concrete policy recommendations to be unanimously approved, I think is an incredible thing. And so I think it really shows you that this is something that we might be able to accomplish on a bipartisan basis, and maybe even give some people hope that Congress still functions and that bipartisan cooperation is still possible.
Yeah, no, this is a great model for how things should be done. It doesn't get the attention. But I said at the beginning, having somebody like you in charge with a mindset not of, defeating the other party, et cetera, as you alluded to, but what is in the best interest of a comprehensive set of American interests that you kind of throughout this conversation have identified is the right approach. It's not going away. AI isn't going away, and I wouldn't want it to go away. I think you're 100% correct. There's been too much focus on the negative impacts. I was laughing at your Terminator reference, and not enough of the beneficial impacts. And I think an approach where we regulate, outcomes and try to focus on some of the beneficial impacts is interesting and a great approach. As you were talking, and I know Dori has a question for both of us, and I have one more for you. But as you were talking, I was wondering rhetorically, because it would take a while to research this, is this fear of newer technologies something that's recent, or were people afraid of the assembly line? Did we have, if you went back and looked, was there the same reaction to the development of the assembly line? Was there the same reaction when we migrated from horses to automobiles? We went from horses to automobiles. Did people have the same reaction as the transition from gas-powered cars to electric cars? I don't know. Is this I don't know. It's an interesting question of the fear of things. Is that a new thing in our country or not? It seems to me, and my perception is generally, we try to make people afraid of things as a way of stopping them. If I want to beat you in an election, I try to make people afraid of you, and vice versa. It's not a one-way street. You said it yourself. So, Dori, why don't you go ahead and ask the question that you wanted to ask both of us?
So my final question for both of you, because I want to hear perspectives from each level, Lloyd being the state level and Congressman Obernolte being the federal level, is this. As AI becomes embedded in everyday decision-making, from hiring jobs and education to public services and even law enforcement, what principles should guide lawmakers in deciding when to act quickly and when to take more cautious approach? And how should those principles be applied differently at the state level compared to the federal level?
Sure. Well, I think that uh, this question addresses all of the things that we have been talking about, right? And so I think the framework that we need to adopt is we need to protect people against the harmful consequences of AI while still enabling the beneficial uses of AI to occur. And those two ideas are in tension, right? We acknowledge that they're in tension. So we need to strike a balance between those two things. And the way that we do that is that by focusing on outcomes and not on tools, as we have been talking about, because that really crystallizes what your responsibility as a regulator is when you can define what it is you're trying to prevent and then translate that into what action does that require of you when you're looking at the deployment of artificial intelligence. And I also think we need to be mindful of the role of government, and this is something where sometimes the two parties don't quite agree, but in general, I would say as Americans, we acknowledge that our country was founded on the principles of freedom, right, and liberty. And so, on the whole, it's not government's job to step in and say to everybody, this is what AI should be, this is what it shouldn't be. Our job is to view that through the lens of what do we have an obligation to protect people against, and we do just that. And then we don't opine on the other things. And, Lloyd, you mentioned it a few minutes ago, prohibition, right? That was something we can agree. Drinking alcohol is generally bad for people. It would be better if no one did it. Yes, we could all agree on that. But, we saw the disastrous consequences of trying to impose that on the American population. And, there have been few times in history that so thoroughly has an idea like that been repudiated. And, the same thing would happen if, for example, we tried to completely ban AI. So it's a balance, and we need to strike that balance. And I think if we approach it thoughtfully, respectfully, calmly, that we can strike the balance.
Yeah, I think, I would agree. As I was thinking about the question, I was remembering something that one of my constituents said. I had the privilege of having legendary basketball coach John Wooden as one of my constituents. And when I was much younger, I attended his basketball camp. And he said something that resonated with me as, not just to me, but when we were in camp, be quick, but don't hurry. And I think that we need to be as fast as possible to not cede our leadership on this issue. And I think the congressman rightly identified that earlier, and just now in his answer, we can't just say no to AI. I mean, first of all, just from a pragmatic, practical standpoint, that doesn't work. And I actually have an example of where we tried that more recently, the prohibition, and it was a colossal failure. I don't know, when I was in the legislature, I was leading the efforts after the federal prohibition on internet gambling to enact intrastate poker. But the actual federal ban on internet poker didn't work. All it did was drive companies offshore. It got rid of any American-based company, but it didn't prevent Americans from playing poker on the internet. It took away all protections because the regulatory frameworks were overseas. So you have to kind of understand that approach when you're trying to regulate these things. Just because you have a knee-jerk reaction to not liking something doesn't mean we should ban it. We should regulate it. We need to look. We have 340 million people in America, and just because the congressman doesn't like something, I might, and vice versa. And how do we govern? And I think from the conversation we've had today, I really am impressed with the approach. I will candidly admit I wasn't following it. I follow AI generally, but I wasn't following the development. But I've been impressed with the approach, the thoughtful, deliberative approach that you've taken. And I probably would have also voted for that. And I agreed, kind of in general on the principles. So that's just kind of how I see things, is we need to make sure that we are protecting people from harm. But the one thing that the only other thing I'd want to articulate is simply this. And it goes back to what the Congress member said. We don't focus enough on the positive. And that's where I think overregulation could also inhibit the positive. The benefits that AI can bring potentially are untold. We focus on the fear, but not the benefits. I know that there are companies who utilize AI to reduce responses to wildfires. Much faster response times utilizing AI-based systems than relying on people to call in fires. Just for one example here in California, and that's, I know the congressman's district is subject to those wildfires as well. So I think you don't want to stifle the innovation that will allow AI to bring benefits that can move the country forward. So with that, I'm going to just take the privilege of asking the last question of the Congress member. You've taken this approach. You're about to put it in statute. If you look back in 15, 20, 30, 40, 50 years, finish this sentence. My legislation, my efforts will have been successful if.
I would say if it achieves the balance between protecting people against AI on the one hand and permitting the beneficial uses of AI on the other.
Okay, I'm going to ask one at a time. Is there anything you're afraid of in this regard? Is there anything that just keeps you awake at night here that potentially you can't even legislate about, but it does keep you awake at night?
Absolutely. And we touched on it just a few minutes ago. The use of AI to enable the spread of mis and disinformation. We already have a problem with this as a society. I mean, my mother is a social media fan, but I still have to explain to her that just because she reads something on Facebook does not make it true. And she thinks that that's true of even comments that people make, because she grew up in an era when there were only 4 television channels, and when you tuned into one of them, the information presented was vetted. And so that's the way that she looks at the world. It just is the assumption that it's been vetted, and it's not. And so, I mean, I debunk conspiracy theories with her all the time. I have to say, no, Mom, that's absolutely not true. Did you do any research? She hasn't, because she just assumed it was right. Well, AI is going to accelerate that trend. And already it's being used that way because false information is so easy to create and disseminate. And anything that people find either infuriating or titillating ends up being spread a lot faster than the truth. In fact, it goes back to what Mark Twain once famously said, where a lie can go around the world before the truth has put its socks on in the morning. And that's true of artificial intelligence in spades. So the problem is that we have to balance that against people's First Amendment rights to say what they want to say and to use AI to help them say it. So this is going to be very difficult for us to navigate as a society. And this is actually the thing that I worry the most about, because already our geopolitical adversaries are using these technologies to sow distrust in our democracy, in our society, to make us distrust each other, dislike each other. They are catalyzing some of these partisan fights that are going on. This is going to get worse with AI, and we're going to have to figure out a way to fix it.
I think that's a great way to close. I agree completely. I think we have more in common than we realize, and I think both parties are being subjected to external forces to gin up the controversies. And so I appreciate your closing thoughts. Thank you for joining us on Policy Chats. We appreciate all of your not just your work today on this podcast, but your leadership in Congress on this issue. It is vitally important to the future generations and to the United States. So thank you for that, and thank you for joining us today.
Absolutely. Thanks. I had fun.
Thank you for listening to Policy Chats, the official podcast of the UC Riverside School of Public Policy. If you enjoyed today's episode, be sure to follow us on Instagram at UCR_SPP. To learn more about our program and upcoming episodes, visit spp.ucr.edu. For the video version of this episode, check out our YouTube channel at UCR School of Public Policy. Until next time, stay informed and stay engaged.